All right, hi everybody. For today's video, my dog will not leave me alone once again, so say hello to Vivian. She will be joining us through a good chunk of this video. Hi, Vivian. Hi, thank you. Okay, but today's video has to do with the Phillips curve. Um, so let's take a look at it. On its basis, the Phillips curve is looking at trade-offs, and those trade-offs has to do with inflation and unemployment. So basically, when the government is enacting policies designed to increase aggregate demand, whether it be fiscal or monetary policies, what they're doing when they shift aggregate demand to the right is yes, they increase real GDP, which does mean a lower unemployment rate, which sounds good. But at the same time, this increases the price level, which creates a higher inflation rate. So you're trading off a lower unemployment rate for a higher inflation rate. So the Phillips curve is the relationship of the inflation rate to the unemployment rate. It shows those trade-offs. So the y-axis is your inflation rate, and the x-axis is your unemployment rate. So on that short-run Phillips curve, if you move up and to the left along the short-run Phillips curve, that is an increase in aggregate demand because you're trading off a lower unemployment rate for a higher inflation rate. If you have a leftward shift in aggregate demand, that's moving along the short run Phillips curve down and to the right. You're trading off a higher unemployment rate for a lower inflation rate. Now, when it comes to supply shocks, that changes the entire relationship of inflation and unemployment. At every inflation rate, you're going to have a different unemployment rate and vice versa. In this case, a negative supply shock is going to shift your SRPC upwards. So a negative supply shock, a leftward shift of supply, shifts your SRPC upward. A positive supply shock is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to shift your SRPC downward. So make sure you remember that because it usually goes against our general thinking. Normally, we think a positive shock shifts things upward and to the right. In this case, it's flipped. A positive shock shifts it downwards, and if you're thinking right left, it would be a leftward shift. So this is one of the very very few exceptions to the rule of a left right shift in econ being positive and negative. Now, where this gets complicated is when we start thinking of inflation expectations. So an increase in the expected inflation rate shifts the SRPC up by that amount. So basically, as people expect things to cost more, firms pay more for workers. This makes their costs increase, therefore making things actually cost more. So you can see, assume the expected inflation rate increases by 3%. You shift everything up by 3% because everybody expects everything to cost 3% more. So that's why the SRPC moves up with inflation expectations. Now, in the long run, most economists are going to agree that there is no long run trade off between lower unemployment rates and inflation. In other words, you can't try to inflate your way into economic growth. You can't try to say that inflation itself can cause the expansion of the economy. And that is why the long run Phillips curve exists, and it's also called it's at the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. So this just means it's the level of unemployment below which inflation is just going to accelerate and therefore can't be maintained. So if we look at it, let's say we're at a 2% inflation rate and a 5% unemployment rate, and we wanted to reduce unemployment. So we institute a expansionary fiscal or monetary policy, and we target a higher inflation rate in order to get a lower unemployment rate. So here we've got almost a 4% inflation rate, and we did that. But then people start adjusting their inflationary expectations, and when they do that, you have a leftward shift of the supply curve, and your SRPC shifts upwards. And then you're back to your original level of unemployment. So you try it again. You try to target a higher inflation rate to get back down to that 3% unemployment. And when people adjust their inflationary expectations, argue for higher wages, Your short run aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve shifts left, therefore shifting upwards your SRPC. And you're back to your 5% unemployment rate. Your LRPC is that unemployment rate. It is your NAIRU. It is your natural rate of unemployment. Now, this should sound a lot like the classical version of things. So since aggregate demand increases, price level increases. As price level increases, the factors of production increase in price. So wages increase, in other words, causing a leftward shift to the SRAS. And that negative supply shock means an upward shift of your SRPC. And that's because your natural rate of unemployment equals your NAIRU, equals your employment level at your long run Phillips curve, equals your employment level at your LRAS, which equals your employment level operating on your PPC. All of these things are linked. Now, just because you have a change in your natural rate of unemployment doesn't necessarily mean that your long run aggregate supply curve shifted or that your PPC shifted. It does mean that your long run Phillips curve shifted because it would move to a different unemployment rate. So it's important to remember that these things are linked, but not the same. So a decrease in your natural rate of unemployment doesn't necessarily indicate economic growth either. But it's important to realize the linkages throughout all of these different things. Now, it is also important to remember the costs of disinflation, because if you are constantly trying to inflate your way to economic growth, you're going to have issues with inflation. Your inflation is going to be too high, and then you're going to need to do something to counteract that. But in order to do that, you're going to have to initiate contractionary policy. So you're essentially having to force a recession in order to decrease that inflation and keep it under control. This is something that actually happened in the later 1970s and early 80s. As we were taming inflation, the Fed kept instituting contractionary monetary policy to force recession after recession in order to get inflation under control, and it is eventually what worked. Now, this is painful, though, because it does cause high unemployment rates. And as you see, that would be the adjustment process here. So let's say you wanted to target a 2% inflation rate. Well, then you have to cause pretty high unemployment in the short run, and then people adjust their expectations, and your short run aggregate supply shifts to the right to correct, and then you keep working until you get down to a more manageable inflation rate. Now, if you go too far, if you start causing deflation, so go below that x-axis, deflation is going to cause your money to be worth more in the future. It means that means people will borrow less money. They will spend less money, which causes more deflation, and it becomes this vicious cycle of people not wanting to borrow money, not wanting to spend money, because if they hold on to it, it will be worth more, and that's safe. So basically what's going to happen is if you have expected deflation, it means lending will stop because nobody's going to want to borrow money at that level. And that wraps up the Phillips curve.